So hello, everyone. I see that folks are still joining in and putting where they're from in the chat. Today's webinar is brought to you by Child Care Aware of America, the nation's leading voice on childcare, and 0 to 3, which works to ensure that babies and toddlers benefit from the early connections that are critical to their well-being and development. My name is Jennifer Boss, and I am the Director of Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Coordination and Strategy here at 0 to 3. So I want to share a little bit about the format for today. I'm going to be asking our guests a series of questions. For our attendees, you are welcome to keep adding in that chat, add questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond and share resources. If we don't get to your question, as Stephanie said earlier, we will follow up with you afterwards, and the webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you. So with the ongoing violence in public spaces and media coverage of these events, young children, including infants and toddlers, may be experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety. And our guest today will answer your questions around how to practically support young children during times of crisis to support their well-being and long-term resilience. And as I said, this event is being co-sponsored by Child Care Aware of America and 0 to 3. So let me introduce our guests today. We have two deeply respected experts that I'm sure many of you know on early childhood trauma. Dr. Chandra Ghosh Ippen is Associate Director of the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California, San Francisco, and Director of Dissemination and Implementation for Child Parent Psychotherapy. Dr. Ghosh Ippen is a member of 0 to 3's board. She is author and co-author of many publications and manuals related to trauma and diversity-informed practice. She's worked on 7 longitudinal studies and has conducted treatment outcome research on the effectiveness of psychosocial intervention programs with Spanish-speaking children and parents. Dr. Ghosh Ippen is also the director of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network Measure Review Database, and producer and director of Vale la Pena Recordar, a Spanish language video on childhood traumatic grief. Dr. Ghosh Ippen received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Southern California and completed pre and postdoctoral fellowships at the University of California, San Francisco. And Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett is a pediatrician and social epidemiologist. She's the founder of Vital Village Community Engagement Network. Her work focuses on the role of early life adversities as life course and social determinants of health. Specifically, she has studied the intersection of community violence, intimate partner violence, and child abuse and neglect and neighborhood characteristics that influence these patterns. Her current work is developing community-based strategies to promote child well-being and reduce child maltreatment using a collective impact approach in 3 Boston neighborhoods. Dr. Boynton-Jarrett serves in the role of Vice President for the Board of Directors for Child Care Aware of America, and in that role leads the Public Health and Child Care Task Force. Very excited to have both of them today on this webinar. So let's start by sort of level setting around why we're hosting this conversation. Today, we're talking about how young children may experience and process trauma. And many of the people in our audience are childcare professionals and experts themselves. Though some people might wonder if young children can experience grief. So let's start there. Can they? And what signs of trauma should we look for in young children, specifically among infants and toddlers? And how might those signs look different from what we observe in older children? So let's start with you, Chandra.
Okay, so I think we all wish that the answer was no. And we need to wrap our heads around that there is a deep wish to think that they are too young, that they're somehow protected. And the truth is that they're just like us, but they have different ways of expressing it. And so what we might see is a child who what they're feeling inside is, if this person went away, will you go away? And one of the signs might be that they're very clingy and holding on to you. They also might turn at other moments and be like, but you're not them. You don't feed me, you don't change me, you don't do. And so you may see them really reject and be angry as well. That's another way that grief can show up with little kids. We can also see that stress affects development. And so when we're thinking about babies, we're thinking about their regulatory processes, how they eat, how they sleep, how they toilet, and all of those things can become impacted. And we can think about how that both, it's a way of showing that my body is out of sorts, as well as that person who would have been caring for me in these moments isn't there. And so even doing these regulatory processes can be very triggering for young children. We see them protest, we see them search over and over that they don't understand where the person might go, have been. And because of their age also, I think one thing that's really important to think about is, very much like us, it hits them in waves. And that we often see that they're crying, but they're crying about things that seem completely not connected to what's going on. And so they may not cry at what we might think of as the appropriate moments. And in fact, sometimes what we see is that, for children who have enough language, when we're trying to talk to them about it, they actually turn away. And that, I think it's very important to think about. There's a concept of the short sadness span. This idea that young children's bodies often, if you think about the stress that goes through with loss and with trauma, it's like their bodies are wise and they say, we can't take this anymore. And so then you might see them really switch activities, or they may play. And we may be wondering, are they really feeling it? Because, we're sitting trying to talk to them and they're kind of going off on their daily life. But then you may notice that other times, like at bedtime, at bath time, that's when they also feel it.
That's so important, just to clarify how young children experience and express these emotions. That's different from what you might expect as an adult. Renee, or an older child. Renee, do you want to add anything to that level setting?
Oh, I think Chandra just hit the nail on the head. I think there is a deep desire and often an underestimation of what children are experiencing and feeling. So that it's important to be aware of that and to work against that. And it's also important to remember that the process of grief is a psychobiological response to bereavement. It's a normal reaction to bereavement, but it can exist along a continuum. Where it can become, prolonged and complicated when there is high levels of intensity and extensive persistence. So just keeping in mind that continuum and thinking about the fact that the healing process might not look linear, as Chandra shared. It can occur in different waves, but that it would be a process, and a complicated grief pattern might be one where there's a lot less flexibility and advancement that you're seeing. So it's just important to keep in mind.
That's actually a good segue into my next question for you all. And that's really about the sort of potential long-term impact on young children's growth and development. So how does exposure to trauma at a young age impact the child over their lifetime? And what are ways to mitigate that impact? And as you're talking about that, what terms are helpful for our audience, for childcare experts to understand, and when thinking about this, such as differentiating stress from toxic stress? Renee, do you want to kick us off?
I'm happy to begin here. So when we think about the terminology of toxic stress, there are kind of two components there. One is that there is a prolonged degree of stress that is occurring. and there is an inadequate ability to respond to that stress. So that degree of stress is kind of overwhelmed by both the social supports and buffers that may exist within the environment. So a stressor can become toxic if there is an inadequate context to support the processing, the resolution, of that. And that can have a significant impact on the functioning of the immune system, inflammation within the body, the management and hormonal regulation of cortisol and other stress measures in the body. And that can affect behavioral regulation, growth, and development. And it can be very insidious because often, unlike our response to physical injuries, we don't often respond as acutely to factors that are below the surface. So our ability to adequately support and address prolonged, chronic, and cumulative stressors in the lives of children that are not showing up as a broken bone, as bleeding with a physical sign, can lead to deterrence of addressing those issues, and that can have cumulative impacts over the life course, or there can be latent effects that you see later on in life. So your ability to learn, to master your environment, to form healthy relationships are all impacted by your ability to heal in the context of safe, supportive, and nurturing relationships. And so our ability to recover from a potentially traumatic exposure or an adverse exposure, or to go through a bereavement process in a way where we can move forward beyond the immediate effects of grief, are really supported by a series of environmental supports. And that, the first things we think about are caregivers. And for children, we think about caregivers, adults, mentors, and those who are consistent members of the social world of a child. And the relationship with those caregivers can help provide and reestablish a sense of safety, can help a child find meaning and understanding through experiences that have happened, and can help children continue to heal, grow, and thrive, to support regular routines, self-care, sleep, nutrition. All of these factors are critical to healing. And we need a larger social context that actually supports caregivers in their efforts to care for children. So we need broader resources in our environment that are caring for the caregivers, parents, educators, grandparents, extended family members. Everyone who touches the life of a child also does need support, particularly if there's been an event of mass violence or collective trauma.
Thank you for that. Renee gave such a thorough answer to that question. Chandra, do you want to add anything to the question about the long-term impacts for children?
Yeah, I think actually if we acknowledge the long-term impacts, children do better. And one thing that's important is to think about how it's adaptive that our bodies remember danger, and that trauma is actually about this. And so that one thing that we acknowledge is that if you've had an experience of danger, anything that's associated with that, if you kind of bump into it in the future, your body may go into an alarm mode. And grownups who acknowledge that can come alongside a child or a family and sort of think about how you're remembering, your body is remembering, and what happens inside. And I think within our field, we really believe that this is your body's way of trying to help you because it's getting ready to mobilize, to fight or flee. And that what we can do is to help you feel, are you now safe? Your body is remembering, but right now you're with me. Right now you're safe. If it's okay, I just wanted to quickly share a couple of pictures that I thought might be helpful to folks. Jennifer, is that okay?
Sure. I'm
Yes.
saying sure. Stephanie, you want to share it on screen or you want to hold
Yeah,
it
no,
up?
I can do that. So I just, I wanted just to share the ABCs of a trauma
Ah.
response. And so where the A is that we're acknowledging when children or grownups have had a moment of fright. And B, we're acknowledging that the body remembers. And C, we're really making a connection between what we're seeing, the behavior, because we know that behavior has meaning, and what the child has experienced. And that as we do that, we can make a better plan. And that plan is really to restore safety, to kind of hold hope, to differentiate between then and now. And as you know, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett said, to also help them make meaning, which is so key. And so if we just remember that our bodies are really in some ways designed to remember danger, and that if we can identify what is it that might trigger a child's danger response, like if I as a caregiver or a therapist identify it to the degree that I can connect with childcare and say, hey, this is one of the things that reminds the child. Like right now, for many kids, we just wrote a piece on fireworks, right? 4th of July, fireworks, the smell of barbecues, crowds. We need to be aware that these might be danger reminders for children who have been through recent shootings. And so to the degree that we acknowledge that the body remembers, we can really serve as buffers in a way, as really people who say, here, we've got you, you're safe.
That's excellent. Thank you. Can you, while we're talking, would you mind, Chandra, putting that slide back up again? I see a number of people asking if they can see it again.
Sure.
And then we can keep talking while it's up for a few minutes. So I think that is so helpful to sort of put that into a frame for us to understand how trauma stays with children and what that can mean long term. And you both have sort of spoken very eloquently about the importance of relationships with adults and how key they are to young children in experiencing trauma. Can you talk a little bit more about how childcare professionals and families can work together to ensure a consistent sense of safety for young children? And Chandra, would you mind starting us off with that?
Sure. So I was just checking to see if I was muted. I do want to build on what Dr. Boynton-Jarrett said. You know, I think in terms of the need that to, in a way, serve as a protective shield, to serve as a buffer for families. And I want to go back to sort of some pictures. I'm a very visual person. And so in early childhood, we have this kind of myth. Children have the myth that the grownups are all powerful. And just this idea that they're bigger, wiser, stronger, kind. And that if we can hold that when there's been danger, sometimes they feel as if the shield has failed. And it may not have failed, but when you see this, just this idea of adaptation. And so how, you know, how different children might show up in different ways. This is just pictures of animals. I'll skip this. Whoops. But I think one of the things that we think about is you are actually there also in a way as a shield. And I should have put the picture actually in between you, the family and the creature, as school and work. And one of the things that you do is that you, in a way, acknowledge what the family has been through. And you create safe spaces where you say, I just moved my shield that is poorly placed to the left, where you're saying there is danger out there, but here you are safe. And you're also saying when your body remembers danger, I am here to be with you and to acknowledge. And I also want to say that we might say, here you can fall apart. Here we acknowledge that you might have days when you're hit by a wave of anger or days where you're hit by a wave of sadness, and we're here. I just want to give you a beautiful example from a childcare professional. There was a child who was having a great deal of difficulty because there was danger in his home. And the caregiver decided to share that with the teacher. And the childcare provider said beautifully, it sounds like this is a child who was getting a lot of restraints because his physical behavior was really out of control. But the childcare provider said, it sounds like on those days, a tiger comes to school and not you. And she said, do you think you could rear at me on the days that the tiger comes to school so I would know that the tiger needs extra special love and care? And so they had this beautiful code where the kid would come in and go, rawr. And then she would go, oh, I see the tiger has come. And she would just sort of wrap him up and bring him closer. And I just loved that, the wisdom of that childcare provider. And you don't have to disclose everything, But you can tell these things. And she was bigger, wiser, stronger, kind, in the words of Circle of Security. That's just one example. I'm sure Dr. Boynton-Jarrett has many others as well.
I love that example. And I feel like it's something for all of us to hold on to. And I so appreciate your comments on, as caregivers and providers and educators, we have to check in about our own feelings and where we're at, because children are in tune with those. So we can't show up authentically to support a sense of safety and healing for children if we're also not doing that for ourselves. So it's okay to let children know you're not okay. It's okay to let them know you feel sad, that you feel grief, that you feel anger and loss. And it actually is also role modeling for them what you're asking them to do in terms of the healing process. So using that really clear, simple language, a validation of their feelings, having patience with their process, their healing journey. These factors are all important, but we really can't show up for children in those ways if we're not acknowledging our own processes as well. I think there's also another really important component of validation that exists on, sorry about that. I think there's another important component of validation that exists on a greater level, on a societal and policy level. And we as a society have to validate the trauma and grief that we're going through. So I'll just give an example. 1 in 450 children in the United States have lost a parent or caregiver in the home, caregiver, grandparent, or another relative, to COVID-19 in the past 2 years. And at the same point in time, we have high disparities and inequities in that loss across race ethnicity. So American Indian children, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian children are 4 times the rate of Caucasian children. African American and Latina children, 2.5 times the rate. Asian American children, 1.6 times the rate. Where is our public validation of this national experience and the tremendous inequities that we see in that experience? So that's just an example of how we could show up differently with our social contract with families and children to support caregivers who are supporting children. If we think about the experiences of early care and education providers during this pandemic, shutdowns, loss of income, loss of livelihood, loss of jobs, high demands, where has the public support for their effort to care for children? What has that looked like? So these are examples of how we can better validate and support these efforts.
Absolutely. And thinking about that in terms of the childcare professionals and specifically talking about trauma, who've also experienced trauma themselves and are also trying to understand and work through their own feelings of grief and loss and trauma. Are there any specific sort of strategies or ways that childcare professionals can be supported so that they can then be available to recognize and validate the feelings of the children in their care that you want to speak to? And that's to either one of you, I'm sorry.
So honestly, I think we need billable hours for our own support. And that I think that it needs to be a part of regular practice, which would be that idea of routine reflective supervision. And I also think that we need permission to not be okay and to let people know that. There was a beautiful example that I ran into where a therapist basically told her client that she was running at 50% and said, you have a choice, you can reschedule, or I would be happy to rebook and only charge you 50%. And I think that for me, I've just been holding that in my heart because I think about how important it is for us all to be able to say, given what's happening, I'm not really where I want to be. But even in acknowledging that giving it voice. So I think so many times we keep things crammed in our bodies. And when things are kind of crammed in our bodies, it affects our health. Like here I am in silence with this stress, trying to forge on. And if I can exhale and breathe, then I'm in community. And I think it's when you're in loving community and that you're not stranded with your story and stranded with your suffering, that's when the healing begins. And so having those spaces where we say, really, we're in this pressure cooker and we need to make a social contract with each other that we're all going to fall apart at some time. And so when we think about that concept of the protective shield, it's I got you, child, I got you, family, I got you, community, and that happens at a societal level, just to build on what Dr. Boynton-Jarrett was saying.
I think that's just like the layered way of thinking about it, in that this is a collective process. It's not about one group of providers being superheroes or being resilient all the time, 24/7. And I think that absolutely we need to truly think about increasing funding for mental health and behavioral health support that is truly integrated into every care environment, every school environment, and accessible to providers and parents themselves. We have these very interesting trade-offs of we'll provide care for the child, but not the parent. We'll provide care for the child, but not the educator. We really have to think about the fact that it is so much more of a win to be comprehensive and holistic. And we also have to involve families and community members and educators in designing and determining how this funding should be spent and how these programs should roll out. If we simply asked, it would not be a guessing game. I think there are so many ways that lay providers and community members are already doing this work. Communities have long historical trajectories of healing practices, ways of coming together, supporting connection, healing, uplift. We wouldn't be here right now if that wasn't the case. The reality is our standard infrastructure discredits and discounts these existing historical legacies and traditions, practices, and assets that communities bring to the table. So if we simply actually dispersed power and resources to the community in these ways, I think we would see an absolute flourishing of all of the factors that we are somehow seeking through a very overburdened and presently understaffed, overburdened, underfunded system that we call like our mental health and behavioral health system. And we're not doing a good job of caring for those providers either. And so we're not really creating a sustainable, resilient system to support thriving for children and families.
Oh, there's a lot of, I see the chat going by pretty quickly, a lot of people who are agreeing wholeheartedly with everything that you were saying. Let's get a little bit specific now and, sort of pointing to the recent Uvalde shooting that took place a few weeks ago. God, I don't even know how long ago it was, in Texas. That area is populated by many Latinx families. And Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, you started to speak about the inequities that exist in access to services and access to supports, and the inequitable impact that some of these tragedies and traumas have on people of color in particular. Thinking about the families in the area in Uvalde, for example, how would you speak with teachers and parents and community leaders about the impact of historical and racial trauma for this community in this example? And I'll start with you, Chandra, and then we'll go to Renee.
I mean, honestly, I think I want to do a whole lot more listening than speaking to start off with. So I just want to start there. And then if I am going to speak, I'm going to hold the words of some of the families that I've been fortunate to get to know. I remember a little boy, 4 years old, African-American, his mother had died, and he said, "Are the police even looking for him?" And it was just the idea of unequal justice. I know that our bodies take a hit when we hear that, right? And a little girl whose family was originally from Guatemala, and she was looking for la buena policía, the good police, the ones who would help her, because she had met la mala policía, and that her family wondered if maybe what had happened to their family was not being taken seriously because they were immigrants. And the reason I share this is because what I would want people to know is this lives in the hearts and souls of our children. And so the way that we are, Jerry's Paul's words, and Marie St. John, how you are is as important as what you do. But we transmit, are you lovable? Are you capable? Are you valuable? And we transmit that in every tiny little thing that we do. And that we need to understand that unfortunately, children through media, through the way their families have been treated or their people in history, they're sitting there kind of saying, are we as valuable as other people? Are you responding to us? Would we get better help if we were a different skin color, if we had a different kind of country of origin? And that is painful to think about. And so in a way, we are partnering in both acknowledging that history when it's appropriate, and also not assuming that that's the way family feels, because I think sometimes there's that danger of a single story of we hear this kind of, that there's this, and that is not what everybody holds. Some people feel that they are valuable and lovable. And so I think this is where we start with listening of where they're from, but we also start with a deep acknowledgement of when within the recent history of our country, we have felt that it's okay to separate babies from parents. And that had a racial, cultural, it would not have happened with other groups if we acknowledge that. And that that is layered. Uvalde is layered with that in terms of the response from the police, the response for some families. So not for all, and it is not for me to put that burden on the family, but it is for me to hold it and to listen and to open the door if that's appropriate. And if they say it, for me to receive it. And I think too often I talk about baseball, we're in pitching mode. We need to be in the catching mode where our bodies do take the hit and where we do sit there and say, yes. And it's so hard and it's wrong.
Thank you so much, Chandra. I couldn't agree more. As I hear you speak, I see how authentic your desire to be in a space of humility with families as the experts of their own stories, as the experts of their own legacies. I completely couldn't agree more that, a cultural humility approach is really one where we are all committing to learning and relearning and relearning. It doesn't end. We don't arrive at a right space where we understand everything and we're masters of all. We really are in a space of learning. And a big part of that is being sensitive to historical realities and legacies of violence. We cannot think of any violent incident in this country without thinking about legacies of violence. In very recent history, as you shared, families were being separated from children. Children were being locked in cages without caregiving needs and basic needs met. We have a long history of separation of children from families in this country dating back to slavery. We have a long history of violence being used as a form of power over. And so we cannot understand how any child in this community develops within the context of that history, without having the humility to appreciate these legacies of violence, and to really be willing to be in communication around power dynamics and their roots and origins. And I just couldn't agree more.
Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, I want to follow up with a question about for caregivers and people who are working directly with parents and families and thinking about cultural humility. What would you say are some strategies or ways that people can begin to even look at their own ways, their own biases that they bring to the work, their own ways that they are seeing and viewing children and families that may impact how they are understanding and taking in and holding the family's stories? Are there places to begin to unpack that?
Mm-hmm. Well, cultural humility, I would view it as a practice, and a practice really can't be strengthened if you don't have a context, whether it is a work culture, whether it is a set of competencies included in training and education, whether it is space. Most of us, in the context of our work, there's meetings we have to go to and things are discussed at those meetings. And if this is not on the table as an area of professional development and growth, then it simply can't come into reality. It can't just show up at a crisis and truly sustain and have the full benefit that children and providers could experience. So we really have to transform how we actually even operate in our work culture. We also have to start to appreciate different forms of wisdom. A lot of us are trained in evidence-based models, which are wonderful, but who's had the power to develop and research and study evidence-based models? We have to appreciate there's been a relatively narrow set of worldviews that have had access to that research and evidence generation. So how do we really begin to look for, appreciate, and uplift culturally relevant coping strategies, ways that families provide ethnic and racial socialization that is positive for children, ways that identities are formed within communities that are not just identities of resistance histories, but are also of pride and strength, and like kind of the diversity of experiences. None of us want to be defined only by the bad things that have happened to us or our family legacies. We are all so much more complex than just the sum of negative things that have transpired or resistance to those negative things. So we have to begin to embrace that and learn from that. And that means softening what we call evidence, right? And broadening our concept of evidence and really welcoming families to the table to be a part of that as well.
Lovely, thank you. Chandra, please.
I'd actually just love to share some visuals to build on that, if that's okay. And yeah, I think it's just really an echo, but I think coming from the Harris Professional Development Network, we have the diversity informed tenets. And just if people are looking for a place to go, and I think really echoing Dr. Boynton-Jarrett, just thinking about how self-awareness leads to better services for families. So I have to look at what are my own biases. What are my cultural values, the ones that I get from my family, the ones I get from my training, really appreciating the lens that I come from. And then it's a constant. This is, I think, the idea of within our work, how are we making space to really lean into where do I have power? How do I use my power? How might my biases lead me to have power over somebody? And what do I want to do with that? How am I kind of constantly questioning and vigilant about those patterns, thinking about Isabel Wilkerson in her book Caste. And if I'm aware of that, and am I acting within that because I grew up in this culture? And then really the emphasis that Dr. Boynton-Jarrett was putting on recognizing and respecting non-dominant bodies of knowledge, really kind of families have their wisdom, cultural groups have their wisdom, and a lot of times that's been robbed from them through historical trauma. Not robbed fully, but people have sure tried. And I think the creating where they lead, and that I just remember Karina Walters, who's a Native American social worker, who said, what were the original instructions of the people? And she's leading people right back to that. And I think for a lot of us who do evidence-based models, what we can think about is there may be a concept that we're working on, like emotion regulation, but cultural groups have always had their ways of supporting co-regulation. Why does it have to be something that is manualized and scientific and feels white to families? Why can it not be the wisdom of the grandmothers that we honor in that way? And so how do we really kind of accept that? Like, I remember being in a meeting where somebody was talking about breathing lavender, and somebody said, breathing lavender is not evidence-based. And I almost hit the roof, because I was like, well, aromatherapy has been around for way longer than us. And so how do we honor those practices and not sort of narrowly state what is good and what is acceptable? And so I'm echoing what you said, but I just wanted to do it with pictures, just in case that helped the visual among us.
Lovely. Thank you so much. The pictures help a great deal. Thank you for adding that in. I think I'm going to ask you one last question, and I think we may have some time for, if I can find the questions in the chat there. I know the chat has been going fast, so we'll try to get back to some of those questions in the chat. But I'm wondering if, for both of you, if you can help our audience consider how we can practically support children, families, and communities. So what resources are available in addition to those that you've already identified for children, for adults to help children support young children who experience the effects of primary or secondary trauma? So what are some practical, really supportive ways that we can provide for childcare providers that help them to support young children who experience effects of primary or secondary trauma? And start with you, Dr. Boynton-Jarrett.
I think really inviting caregivers to the table to really help craft and author what would be most helpful for them is like kind of the one thing that hasn't been tried yet, right? Like, I think there's a lot of thinking on behalf of, and so I think that we need to formalize that. I think that as opposed to generating advisories and committees in response to a trauma, we really need to formalize children's cabinets throughout this country. We really need to formalize spaces where there are diverse stakeholders and members of the community that are a part of ongoing decision-making, and children should be a part of it as well. I think we underestimate and undervalue the wisdom that young people have to share about ways that they feel safe. And we also miss the opportunity to engage them fully as citizens. And that's just basic supporting of their humanity and their dignity, right? And I think we also underestimate how powerful that can be for young people, and what a powerful message it sends to exclude them from decision making that actually involves their well-being. Think of the COVID-19 pandemic. Who asked, how would you like to experience virtual school and learning and socialization? And so we see a lot of bright spots of young people taking the reins and breaking through at the fray. But what if we had centered their voices from the beginning? What if we had centered the voices of educators from the beginning? I think we would have ended up in a fundamentally different place. And we are all well aware of the mental health crisis that is existing. And I'm not saying our not asking them is the cause of it, but it could have been an actual proactive contributor to restoring, repairing, and healing mental health in real time that I think was a missed opportunity. I think we have to think about multi-generational strategies consistently, and we really have to be able to address structural racism and violence and its role in our society. I know that for me, as someone who has dedicated my entire life to the well-being of children, is focused on the prevention of violence in the lives of children, this moment humbles me, and it causes me to rethink how we can work together collectively in a different way on behalf of children. I don't think we're honoring our social contract with children, and we all need to do differently and not just more. I think what's happened is there's a lot of doing more. But I'm at a moment where I'm very open, and I think other people on this call are open as well to working together in a new and different way, because I think we are not going in the right direction despite tireless efforts.
Amen. Amen to that. Dr. Ghosh.
So I think just thinking about a core concept of trauma is that trauma can often rob you of your sense of competence and capacity. And so really starting with, we see you as capable, we see you as lovable. Like it's not a resource, but it's a stance. And that I think allowing people, like not allowing them, it's even that word, but just the idea of, I see the beauty in you, and that we create context where that beauty is heard and flourishes. We are creating an environment where your internal resources can grow. It's a better garden in a way. And I think that's a framework that is so important. But I also want to say that as childcare providers, you and the way that you are an amazing resource. And I just think about those people who are basically saying to a child in a family, I just remember one person, kid had been through a lot, and it was sort of, the stance was, I got you, Peanut. I was just like, okay, right? And that, like, when this kid was having a hard day, it was like, let it out, baby, let it out. Because, you've got things inside you. And that is a resource. That is a relational resource. So I want us all to hold on to the beauty of relational resources. And then we can get concrete, because the truth is, it does help children to see that they're not alone, in families, that they're not the only ones. And sometimes it's a great relief to breathe. So Sesame Street has some really great resources in their Sesame Street and Communities programs. They have the veilance, and so we can put up links. 0 to 3 Shelter from the Storm series is also really good as a guide to help childcare professionals as well as parents. I have a free webinar called When We Are Scared, and in Spanish, Cuando Tenemos Miedo. And I do want to encourage you all to think about children's books as resources for grown-ups. And so if you look at books, for example, like A Terrible Thing Happened, the idea that books, I think we want to focus on joy and thriving, but we also want people to let them know that when they have hard things inside, then you're not the only one. And so there's A Terrible Thing Happens. I wrote a book called Once I Was Very, Very Scared. There are books where children show tantrums. Those are great. Moody Cow Meditates, How Are You Peeling? Because they show the range of feelings. And what they're basically saying is, this too can happen. This too can be felt. And when it is, I think there's some core fears that we have. And one of the core fears is kind of fear of being bad. And so children have this, in early childhood, this fear of being bad, of being kicked out. And so books that show that you can lose it and be lovable. And people who echo that as well, because when you've been through all this stuff, you have tremendous strengths, and you're just going to have days when you lose it. And in fact, that is maybe part of resilience is, Dan Siegel says that to heal it, you've got to feel it. But to feel it, you have to have a context that isn't asking you to shut down your feelings, that isn't asking you to show up in a certain way. Oh, and somebody just noted The Rabbit Listened, another really great book, which again, I just think that these books are for grownups. Like, we read them and we know, this is what I can do. And just by being, I am a resource. I don't have to over-resource you with stuff, because I think the biggest resource is your loving presence and the safety that you create in that. And it's not just for children, it's also for parents, and it's also for each other that we do this.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So many, and others are putting other books, it looks like, in the chat as well. I want to see if we can squeeze in a question or two. One of our listeners put a question in the chat. How can we help parents or caregivers acknowledge that their child has experienced or is experiencing trauma? If they are claiming resilience or viewing their kids as too young to know what's happening. So I think this question really is about how to help the caregivers or the parents understand that children also experience trauma. You talked a little bit about that, I think, in the beginning, but it may be some practical sort of conversations with parents and caregivers about that.
So I think the first thing is when a parent comes to me and they're acknowledging resilience is I want to listen to that. So I do want to really, because I think we all carry, I think Alicia Lieberman encourages us to integrate light and shadow, risk and hope. And so wherever the family is, if they're coming in with hope, you hold hope. But then you listen, because often when you hold hope, people will share and they'll say, and I'm worried about this. And the idea that we can hold both. And then in our work with families, what we often see is that parents survived by forging on. That culturally, there wasn't somebody, because of trauma, intergenerational, sometimes historical, they didn't have a safe base to share things. And so we sometimes adapted in certain ways that we had to. And when, though, you provide a space for them where they can share, they often breathe. Like, I think there's this notion of in infant mental health of the parallel process. How do I give to my child something that I might not have had? And so it's so important that we have spaces where we also receive that, where we can both be honored for our incredible strengths, as well as to say, and I'm not sleeping so well. And I find myself doom scrolling. I find myself doing things that are not ideal. And so to be able to have that as well.
I so appreciate that. I think we have to just kind of really building on that, not discrediting what families are saying, but really listening for the story below the line. So language is powerful, and our screenings and our trauma inventories and our social screenings are not risk neutral for families, particularly if you are socially marginalized in this country. We have a child protection system that provides a disparate amount of surveillance to lower income families and families of color. It is a fact, it is a reality. And so our efforts to be helpful are understood by families within a broader social context of inequitable degrees of surveillance and service provision that does not always feel like helpful and is not necessarily centered around their decision-making. So I think what Chandra just described is a very family-centered process of embracing and not judging the descriptors that families are using, which builds trust and opens the door for other conversation. And I like to talk with families just about what they've observed about their child, not the labels. So I think sometimes we also have to be willing to receive feedback about some of our screening tools, our language, even the language of trauma. We have to be able to accept different cultural frameworks and different ways of understanding healing and understanding illness. And do we have humility to do that? Or is it just right or wrong, right? There's no therapy, there is no pill, there's no medication that can replace a primary caregiver in the life of a child and the benefit that they can bring as an advocate in terms of their attachment and support for that child. So I am often in a position where I'm truly trying to understand, honor, and strengthen that relationship rather than undermine it. There are many experiences, particularly families of color or families that face socioeconomic, lower socioeconomic status and discrimination based on that, where there is power over them based on expertise that is being shared. How do we reverse that?
Thank you so much. That's an excellent place to end. So I just want to say to everyone, first, thank you to Dr. Ghosh and Dr. Renee Boynton-Jarrett for this webinar and for sharing your expertise with us. It's been amazing. Please connect with Child Care Aware of America and with 0 to 3. Child Care Aware of America is www.childcareaware.org, aware.org, and 0 to 3 is www.0to3.org. For everyone who registered, we'll be following up over email with a list of resources, and I think we can add a book list in there. I saw that in the chat that was shared today. And again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined. We very much appreciate you. This was an excellent conversation and so important. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, Chandra, and Stephanie. Chandra, it was an honor. Thank you. I learned so much.
So lovely to do this with you, Renee and Jennifer. Thank you all.